Hi there, my name is Lucas Weiss and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For episode 49, I'm joined by Len Elmore, an All-American basketball player at the University of Maryland who became a 10-year ABA-NBA player before going into a career in broadcasting as well as becoming an attorney and a professor. In this episode, I chat with Len about all these careers, his approach to calling basketball games, working with Verne Lundquist to call the Kentucky Duke 1992 Elite Eight Classic, as well as a candid conversation about the intersection between sports and social issues. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. With this episode being published, it's on the United States Independence Day. So I wish all of my followers, viewers, and listeners a happy 4th of July, stay safe, and enjoy the festivities. Now let's get to episode 49 with Len Elmore of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Len Elmore. He was an All-American at Maryland, a 10-year ABA, NBA veteran, a color commentator for college basketball and the NBA for various media outlets, and then, of course, became an attorney from graduating from Harvard Law School, which he's proudly supporting today. And he also teaches some seminars at Columbia University. Len, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. My pleasure.
Well, you know, your career has so many fascinating different stops, but maybe I'll just start by, asking you, was becoming a basketball player always, one of your life goals?
Well, Lucas, believe it or not, the sport I played most was baseball. I growing up in New York City, first Brooklyn, New York, and then we moved to Queens. I love the game of baseball. I really gave basketball no thought until I was around 14 years old, and I was playing in my middle school yard with a bunch of kids, and obviously I'm taller than most, and didn't really know how to play the game, but it was half court, and I would just grab the ball, hold it over my head, and a lot of people thought that I looked like Chief from Cuckoo's Nest, that type of approach. But I had a PE teacher who came to me and asked whether or not I felt insecure playing with all these little people, and how would I like to play with people my size. And I said, sure. So a week later, he took me down to this high school where it was little beknownst to me. It was a tryout, but I was a pretty good athlete. I could run, I could jump. We had the center jump, and as I said, I didn't know how to play the game. And so they tipped the ball and took off, and I'm still standing at half court saying, how do you guys know which way to run? That's how little I knew about basketball. But, I kind of adjusted, I adapted. That school happened to be Power Memorial Academy in Manhattan. And my first year was my sophomore year in high school, which was a learning experience. Then, of course, played in the Rucker tournament between my sophomore and junior year and learned an awful lot. Came back my junior year, and I was all-city. My senior year, I was all-city and high school All-American. But to fully answer your question, never thought about being a professional athlete at all. I'd always wanted to be a lawyer. Grew up watching, the legal television shows, Perry Mason, The Defenders, shows like that. Because I grew up during a tumultuous time. Civil rights movement was going on. The war in Vietnam was raging, and I thought you could affect change through the law. And so that was my dream and my goal, to be a lawyer.
And of course, you eventually became a lawyer much down the road, but you then were an All-American at the University of Maryland from 1971 to 1974, and those were, from what I imagine, like the early, days of, the NCAA tournament. And what I can imagine is a lot different back then to when the spectacle is now.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat. And certainly the numbers of fans, the exposure, the distribution of the game on television and various media outlets. But it was still a big deal. My sophomore year, we couldn't make it because we lost in the ACC tournament finals to the number 2 team in the nation, North Carolina. And let's remember, during the times I played, the ACC was a one-bid conference. Mm-hmm. So you had to win the tournament to be able to go. And my junior year, we actually went, even though we had lost by 1 point to North Carolina State with David Thompson, simply because they were on probation, and we were by default declared the winners at that particular time. And we got to the Elite Eight and didn't quite make it to the Final Four. And then my junior year, we played against the number 1 team in the nation, who was, again, NC State with David Thompson and their group. We were number 4 in the nation, and one of us was not going to the NCAA tournament. We lost to them in overtime. We had to go home, and I'm sure there were not, with a field of 32 or 28, there were not any teams much better than we were at the time. But, those were the rules back then. That was the format back then. Of course, the year after, our game, which many people thought was one of the greatest college games played, the year after that, the NCAA expanded the field because they saw the absurdity of the top 14, 2 of the top 4 teams in the nation not playing in the NCAA tournament. Didn't help me much, didn't help my teammates much, but nevertheless, that's the role we played in history.
Well, right, you're right. I mean, like, at least, for you guys, while you didn't get, to experience, qualifying for the NCAA tournament, you could have been the reason why many teams down the road could, because of an expanded field. And now, of course, it's, definitely now with, 64 teams. And Len, I mean, for you, of course, get drafted, to, first round draft pick in both the ABA and the NBA. And, for many of my listeners who, grew up, in the just NBA era, I mean, what was it like as a player to be playing in like both of these leagues?
Well, I mean, it was obviously an honor to be chosen first round in both. I opted for the ABA for financial reasons. They offered more money. And the team that offered more money was a very financially stable team, the Indiana Pacers. So I wound up going there, even though the other team that drafted me in the NBA was the Washington Bullets, which was right in the backyard of the University of Maryland in College Park. But in retrospect, I'm happy I didn't make that choice because, I think it would have been a major distraction in my career to go and play for the hometown team, so to speak. But nevertheless, it was one of those things. I played in the ABA that was a much more colorful, wide-open league. They had the three-point shot, which, created more space for driving lanes, had some terrific athletes. I named one of them, David Thompson, but certainly the guys like Artis Gilmore, Dan Issel, played against Julius Erving, obviously. Marvin Barnes opted to go there. Guys like Maurice Lucas played in the ABA for a while. I'm just thinking of there's so many great players that people don't even know of that played in the ABA. And I would recommend to your readers to go look up a lot of those names. Bobby Jones, who great player in North Carolina and for the 76ers, started in the ABA. So many guys played. Ultimately, our teams were incorporated into the NBA in 1976. There were 4 teams from the ABA that were incorporated because of their financial stability. San Antonio Spurs, the Nets, the New York Nets, the Denver Nuggets, and the Indiana Pacers. And, I talk about San Antonio, you talk about Ice Gervin, players like that. So, we were very representative. In fact, in that first All-Star team, when the 2 teams merged, there were more ABA players, I believe, than NBA players in that first year. I think the leading scorer in the NBA was an ABA player. I think the leading rebounder was a former ABA player. But if they weren't, they were pretty close to the top. My misfortune was that first year when we merged, I had just come off my second year where I averaged almost 15 and 11. And in training camp in that third year when we were about to enter the NBA, I tore ligaments in my right knee. And I had to miss just about almost all of the season, but for 6 games. And, once you hurt your knee, medical technology then wasn't what it is today. And, it took a long time to try and recover. So I never really got to play at my peak. But nevertheless, I was able to hold on and play another 7 years.
And, in that 10-year career, Len, I mean, you obviously go on to become, a broadcaster after your career, and we'll get into more of your, various broadcasting duties. But what did playing, the game, teach you and give you that, you could then take into the broadcast booth and become a really knowledgeable color analyst?
Well, I mean, the things that you learn and the people from whom you learn it are extremely important. And, having the experience of not only playing, which I did get a chance to continue to play, but I was not a starter until I think my 8th year in the league, where I was a starter for the New Jersey Nets. But sitting on the bench, analyzing, evaluating what's going on, being able to have to make adjustments and adapt as a player, a role player coming off the bench, teaches you an awful lot. I think being a role player in many ways is more difficult than it is to be a starter because of the lack of consistency in your play, and you never know against whom you're going to match up with. You never know what situations you're coming into. And so that allows you to get a better understanding. It forces you to focus on what the other guys are doing before you get in, because you don't have a chance to, take a little bit of time to warm up and rev up like starters do in a game. Once you hit that floor as a guy off the bench, you got to be ready to go. And I think that's helped me, as an analyst, to be able to recognize trends and tendencies, kind of insert myself in the game, even though I'm not in the game. But, you had to prepare and develop that readiness and to be able to articulate it, sitting there with other guys on the bench to talk about what's going on. I think a combination of all those things were very valuable in helping me in the future career of sports broadcasting.
Well, you hit the nail on the head with preparation. And I think for a lot of my listeners who are aspiring broadcasters and journalists, prep is everything. And, whether it's, for an interview like with you right now or doing, a big game, the more that you prep, the more you're just going to feel natural in that position. Whether you're a role player in an NBA game or calling a game, you'll just feel, a lot more ready for any situation that the game throws to you. And I'm sure you can relate to this, Len. Like when you're preparing for games as a broadcaster, you might not use a lot of the prep that you do, but at least you have it at your disposal that you can rely on to really enhance the quality of the broadcast.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like practice. I always say the more you practice to the point of exhaustion, obviously, the more confident you are when you finally get into performance mode. And it's the same thing with broadcasting. The more prepared you are and the more information you have, the better you feel about yourself and about your broadcast. The more you're able to draw on to provide color and analysis. Oftentimes, people think that certain guys aren't prepared, and sometimes you can tell. But I'm one that has always been able to put my sheets together, put my information together, do my research prior to games. And sometimes I may not be able to talk about everything. Sometimes you're not capable of touching on everything. But nevertheless, going through those motions really help you prepare.
And what's the transition to, broadcasting and on air, challenging for you, Len? Because, of course, you're playing the game of basketball, but now you're in the spotlight of television, and, that presents a whole list of challenges too, being able to articulate and communicate. But was that a challenge, or did you transition to that seamlessly?
Well, being able to articulate and to be an advocate for the game, as well as being somewhat of a teacher, it progresses. But I never had any real problems, particularly articulating the game. Look, my first gig as a sportscaster came in my second year of law school. I was the first African American announcer for the ACC network, Jefferson Pilot and Raycom. And I'll never forget, in my first game, I'm all prepared, I think, and I've got both of these teams down. I understand everything they've done. I've watched tape, and I've got in our open, I've got a legal pad full of stuff about that big, ready to go, and I have my producer walk by and look at me and take my pad and throw it on the floor and say, "You only got 30 seconds." And so that's what taught me the value of being succinct, to be concise, but nevertheless be comprehensive. And that's what I tell young broadcasters today, particularly color analysts. You have to be comprehensive, but you have to learn how to be concise in that comprehension of the game, and to pass it on to viewers. You have to be a teacher. Speak in pictures. Not only tell them what they saw, and that's not always necessary, but tell them why and tell them how. And I think I'm in 32 years now of broadcasting. I think that served me well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the TV often tells the story, so it's not like radio where you have to, analyze every single, play and, give a picture of what's going on. The picture is in front of you, but you still need to communicate it in a concise way. And it's not like you're writing an 800-word story where you have the time to be a little bit more expansive and elaborate on certain topics. You only have a short amount of time because another play is happening right in front of your eyes.
Yeah, the game is fast. You got to get in, you got to get out. And one other thing I omitted was the fact that not only do you tell them how and why, but also at some point you try to be a prognosticator because of all the things that have transpired thus far. What will happen going forward? Give the fans something to think about, something to watch for. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong, but nevertheless, it piques the interest of the viewer.
You've called, NBA games as well as college basketball games. Is there a difference as a broadcaster for you? I mean, obviously different levels of play, but for you, is it still relatively the same in terms of your approach to calling the game?
To an extent. I haven't called an NBA game in a long time, primarily because, I know that I have more interest in calling a college game because of its unpredictability, because of the nuance involved, as opposed to the pro game where, usually the best team wins. Rarely are there upsets per se. With pro games, you find yourself saying a lot of the same things. These guys are so good, and they make the game look so easy. So many times when you listen to announcers, they don't talk necessarily about the game itself. They're talking about so many other things that are peripheral to the game, because the game is coming easy and people can see exactly what's going on, even though, as I said, that how, why, and what's going to happen certainly applies. But the college game is different, particularly when you get to the NCAA tournament level, when it's one and done. You win or you go home. Now you have some of the great teams that are up against teams that, don't measure up to them on a daily basis, but for that one game, people rise to the occasion. And on the other side, with the superlative teams, sometimes they're fallible. And when the two of them meet, you wind up having an upset. And, that's where you do your best evaluation, your best analysis as to why and how this can happen. Plus, it's just exciting, because for the most part, the outcome is undetermined until you tip the ball.
So it's the NCAA tournament. Obviously, in those early rounds when you're at a particular city, you may be calling multiple games per day. What's that preparation like? Like, that week of, like, are you working on, one game more than the other? Are you trying to split the games, in terms of preparation? Because it's, preparing one game is a lot, but now you're preparing multiple games. It must be quite the juggling act.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing the NCAA tournament more on than off, but almost 20 years when I was doing it. And for the most part, I did the preparation myself, although the last couple of years I have a group that I work with that helps dig a little bit deeper and helps me prepare with notes, etc. But nevertheless, I still have to study that. In the end, it comes down to just a lot of hard work. I think each game gets the same amount of care. I mean, it's still played. It's still on television. I'm not going to give short shrift to one game in favor of another, although sometimes you have the temptation to do so if the matchup is one of those, dream matchups. But they all get the same attention because, you find interest and you find, mystery in every matchup, whether it's 15-1, 16-1, or, if it's in the next rounds, if it's two seeds that are closer to each other. I have been fortunate enough to do a 15-2 upset. I did Syracuse and Richmond a long time ago. I've been around enough to see a lot of other upsets, and I've also seen thoroughbreds play each other to the wire. So, I've run the gamut in what I've been able to witness.
Well, speaking of thoroughbreds going down to the wire, I'd be remiss to talk about the Duke Kentucky East Regional Final Elite Eight. And
nice segue, right?
Bring a smile to your face, and for any of my college basketball listeners, it does as well. And I was fortunate to watch a rerun, during when the March Madness would be of that game because it was on CBS. And I'm just curious for you, Len, because that game was just so close, all the way down. And, of course, we have, the Grant Hill, Christian Laettner shot. Was it in that moment, like right after the fact, or did it take you a few hours to sort of let it sink in what you and your play-by-play broadcaster, Verne Lundquist, had called?
I think we recognized that we were witness to something special. Wasn't so sure it would go down in the annals of the absolute greatest until you heard a lot of the writers along Writers Row talking about it in those terms. And of course, they compared it to what game? Maryland NC State in 1974. So here I am, not only did I play in one of the greatest games, and now having it compared to what a lot of people consider the greatest game, and having been a part of that by announcing was something special. But, at that time, we can analyze and break it down throughout the game. I was very fortunate to be with one of the all-time great announcers, Verne Lundquist. Give Verne plenty of room, but I was able to get in, as he gives me room, get in and provide my analysis. And we saw things that last to this day. Why didn't Rick Pitino put a man on the ball, allowing Grant Hill the full vision to throw the ball so accurately to Christian Laettner? Why was Sean Woods that shot, as I said, was a terrible shot, but nevertheless it went in. And that's the only way you measure shots. Did they go in or not? You had some of the prototype players of the future, Jamal Mashburn at 6'7", 6'8", a power forward, but could handle the ball, shoot it outside from beyond the arc, very mobile and agile. That's what we see today in power forwards. So that game was a precursor of an awful lot of things. And, as I said, I was just very fortunate to be a part of it.
But, in saying that as well, Len, like, it's interesting because, in that game, like, there were a lot of juniors and seniors on the court and playing as well, which is something that, unfortunately, the way college basketball is going today, with the one and done, it's just something that you don't necessarily see. So, it was a throwback in many ways. Certainly you mentioned some of the precursor to certain trends today, but it sort of shows that even back then, the older experienced players on both teams could put together a really fun game to watch that came down to the wire.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a terrific point. The game was better played. The game demonstrated the experience of players who understood how to play the game. And they also played a brand of team basketball that you don't see a whole lot today. I mean, you do see it, but don't see a whole lot. Oftentimes, when you have those blue chippers who come in as freshmen, it's isolate, move out of the way, let them do their thing. But back in those days, you still moved the ball. Guys played with each other. And it was probably the last remnants of that kind of basketball. It reminded me of the days when I played. And we had on that floor in the NC State Maryland game of 1974, we had 7 NBA players on that floor. A number of them were first-round picks, including myself, my teammate Tom McMillan, my other teammate John Lucas. On their team, they had David Thompson, Tom Burleson, a guy by the name of Mo Rivers. So we had a ton of guys who ultimately became NBA players that were upperclassmen and knew how to play the game. And that's what you saw up until maybe the last 10 to 12 years.
And from a broadcast perspective, Len, it's amazing that viewers of that game on TV experienced it with no scoreboard, underneath at the bottom of the screen. It's quite amazing how things have changed. And I'm just curious for you as broadcasters, did you guys have to say the score a lot more in the time back then, knowing that there was no constant scoreboard at the bottom of the screen?
Well, I didn't have to worry about that. That fell on my play-by-play shoulders. So I think Verne was such a sublime professional. He knew how to weave it in and out. And, he understood when you had to give the score and when you allowed the action to speak for itself.
And you speak of Verne, who, of course, has done a lot of, sports from college basketball, college football to the Masters in golf. And I'm just curious from a basketball perspective, the importance of the chemistry between the play-by-play and the color commentator. How often did you and Verne work off the cameras together and just developing that chemistry and figuring out what works for you guys and what doesn't in calling a game?
Rarely are you able to work together. I would say almost no time. But you're allowed to spend time with each other. We can sit and have a drink and talk about the game. We can sit in our meetings, our production meetings, and talk about the game and what we see, what we would like to talk about, et cetera. And you kind of develop the rapport there. And honestly, it takes a little bit of time before the analysts and play-by-play could develop a cadence, a rhythm with each other, so you're not stepping on each other. You got to be very careful of doing that. Knowing when he stops, that's your time to get in, and vice versa. And it's all about not having an ego. The worst cases of analysts and announcer not getting along and not having that rhythm and cadence is that when one or both have an ego where they have to say everything, when they have to keep getting their lines in, when they have to make their special call. The one cardinal rule is down the stretch, last shot, analysts stay out of the way and let the play-by-play announcer make the call, because that's their bread and butter. That's what they get known for, making the call. My job is just to provide the analysis, the teaching band, if you will. But the play-by-play guy is the one that's usually featured.
Shifting gears now, and talking about, your other career, which is being a lawyer. And you mentioned how, you always wanted to be a lawyer, and you got your JD at Harvard Law, and you're also teaching at Columbia University. I'm just curious if those two, paths and careers have, provide you with the satisfaction that initially why you wanted to get involved in those careers.
My career has taken a lot of turns, since I ended my basketball days. As you say, having graduated from law school, I could have gone to a lot of the larger corporate firms. I was courted by a couple specifically, but, recognizing that I was so fortunate to have the life that I had, I thought it was important to, contribute to society in some way, shape, or form. And so I made the choice to join the district attorney's office in Brooklyn, New York, which was the borough of my birth, and thinking that, I could have some positive impact. And let me say, as a prosecutor, people think of prosecutors as persecutors, but that's not the case. We have a lot of discretion as to what cases are being tried. We have a lot of discretion as to charges being brought. And, we want to be able to treat people equal under the law if you're a good prosecutor. Our mantra is, or the mantra was when I was a prosecutor, seeking justice, not to merely convict. And I thought that was very important. I could have been a defense attorney, but I'd have to react to what the police and what the district attorney's office did. I'm kind of a proactive guy, and so I wanted to be the one to make the decisions as to what was going forward. And the most progressive district attorney's office that I knew of was Elizabeth Holtzman's office in Brooklyn, New York. So I was fortunate to start there. And, I was there for about 4 years. Among my duties, besides prosecuting misdemeanors and felonies, I also prosecuted police misconduct. And obviously it's so relevant today because I see so many similarities in police behavior. I see so many similarities in, the lack of restraint. Crime, unfortunately, doesn't change. Many of the same issues back then occur now, but you would think that we'd have a better process in America of policing. And we just haven't. In fact, it's gotten worse, in my belief. And so, I can speak from experience there. And after, leaving the DA's office, which I had to, because my wife and I were raising a family in New York and getting paid $45,000 a year, wasn't necessarily going to get it, considering, what I went through and, how I paid for law school, et cetera. And so I joined a couple of firms. I was a consultant for a while. I ran a couple of companies, an education technology company that helped disadvantaged school districts. I also ran iHoops, which was a joint venture of the NBA and the NCAA in trying to improve youth basketball. So, I've had a lot of turns. Now getting here to Columbia in their sports management program, I thought it's interesting now to take my institutional knowledge and pass it on to, young potential business leaders in the world of sports, particularly those who are going to wind up in the C-suite. Hopefully, I can use that experience and that institutional knowledge because, otherwise, what am I going to do with it? I can't take it with me.
No, for sure, and might as well pass it to the younger generation coming up in the industry. And in doing some research for this interview and looking at some of the courses that you're teaching, you're teaching a course in the fall, athlete activism and social justice in sports. And what a time right now for athlete activism, particularly in college sports. I'm seeing, Len, like Canadian Chubba Hubbard, college football running back for Oklahoma State, and some others, saying like, look, I'm not gonna provide my services of playing, this sport unless the university is gonna make changes and really, make sure that it addresses anti-Black systemic racism. So I'm just curious the importance in teaching young people getting into the sports world about the intersection between sports and social issues.
Well, as we know, athletes, particularly celebrated athletes, have a tremendous platform and have influence, and certainly influence for positive change. And if you don't teach history, as Santayana said, you're doomed to repeat it. And we look at throughout the history, particularly in the United States, of socioeconomic and political repression, and you look at the role that athletes have played in protesting against that. We go all the way back in my course to post-Civil War when sports became a thing, kind of helping people forget. and the influence and participation of black athletes, particularly, and how people used the law and used society against their participation. You know, some of the greatest horse racing figures, in the first two Kentucky Derbies, 11 of the 13 jockeys in those were all black. They were some of the highest wage earners in America. But because of the dominance of blacks, they found a way in the 1880s to develop private clubs that excluded blacks, and those private clubs were only allowed to race in the racetrack. Jackie Robinson wasn't the first African American to play in what was considered Major League Baseball. A guy named Moses Fleet Walker played in baseball until a gentleman's agreement by Captain Henson, the owner of a team in the Midwest, decided they were going to exclude him. And then you go on and on. Jack Johnson thumbed his nose at the social convention, racial convention, to the disgust of most of white America. You have Jesse Owens, Paul Robeson, who was outspoken. We know Jackie Robinson's story. We know Joe Louis was a quiet warrior all the way up. And each time you saw how they fought against law and society and convention. And it's not only black athletes. We have white athletes who helped. Alice Marble was a tremendous tennis player, and it was her writing that helped Althea Gibson get a chance to win Wimbledon as the first African-American to do so. And now we're all the way up to Colin Kaepernick and beyond right now. As you mentioned, college athletes are starting to understand the power that they wield, and, the understanding that, they can stand for justice and stand for the right things and still, gain an awful lot of resonance in society. So I'm hopeful that they use that perch to do the right thing. And, my course is something that kind of identifies, it educates people in the nascent parts of their careers before they get to their careers in the C-suite in sports.
One final question for you, Len, and it just sort of builds off of what you're saying, because I feel like sports journalists and broadcasters, and listen, I mean, when they get, when they're assigned to a beat or calling a different sport, there's a lot that goes into that, just knowing about the sport. But I see now, particularly in this time when there's a lot of social commentary where sports journalists want to inject themselves into a conversation, and they may just not be knowledgeable in certain areas, whether it's in law or history or these social issues. I'm not saying, the knowledge of a lawyer like yourself, but how important is it for sports journalists or broadcaster to have at least, an understanding of the law, of history, to be able to, inject themselves into meaningful conversations and provide meaningful commentary?
Well, there's so much information available. There's no excuse not to be literate on a particular subject. If you're going to enter into the debate, you have to come in with some ammunition. And I think it's extremely important. We've seen that time and time again, not only with journalists, but even some athletes. I just harken back to the Hong Kong situation. You had a lot of athletes speak up, not really knowing, what's going on. They were thinking more about their pocketbook and siding with China than truly understanding what citizens of Hong Kong were going through. And I tried to explain to them, it's literally tantamount to them telling us in America that in 20 years from now, we are going to destroy the Bill of Rights. They will no longer apply to you. Young people particularly would raise their eyebrows, and their ire would be raised enough where they'd get out in the streets and demonstrate also. And that's essentially what has happened and what will happen in Hong Kong. So you have to truly understand, and you have to, in solidarity, work with, that situation. If you're going to speak out in favor of freedom as opposed to in favor of your pocketbook.
And do you have, any advice for just broadcasters, in general in this industry, Len? I know you've spent many years in front of the camera and we've talked about it here, but, it's such a competitive industry, and, you have to be able to have, not just, the knowledge of the game and looking presentable and relatable, but, just more skills now in journalism and broadcasting, I think, compared to probably when you first got into the industry.
Well, the only thing I can say is obviously you have to know your stuff. And just like anything else, you try to separate yourself from the pack. But in doing so, you have to be yourself. You know, I've seen so many color analysts particularly try to copy other guys and their styles, et cetera. And I told them, look, I've been doing this thing for 30-something years. And the only person I've been is myself. And I think you can get there as well. So, you know, those are the couple of things that I can, you know, I can impart, and I can also say good luck. You know, you always keep an eye out for the break, for that opportunity.
Len Elmore, he was a basketball player, an All-American, 10-year ABA, NBA veteran, a commentator, a lawyer, a teacher, and he provided such a wealth of information and knowledge and advice today. Len, thank you so much for joining me on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
My pleasure. Thank you.